Support for today's episode comes from Amazon. Amazon is working toward a carbon-free energy future, doing more with less, investing where it matters most, and supporting communities where we operate. Q2 didn't deliver. Here's the real planning problem for July. Q2 didn't resolve what executives hoped it would. That's the planning problem for July. Three conditions that executive teams expected to clarify between January and June didn't. The question now isn't how to recover the original plan. It's how to build one that doesn't depend on resolution that isn't coming. There's a version of Q2 2026 that was supposed to make things clearer. Capital was ready to deploy. Regulatory signals, however scrambled, were expected to settle into something workable. Supply chains, after years of disruption, were supposed to be stable enough to plan around. None of those expectations fully landed. That's not a complaint about the quarter. It's the planning problem sitting on the desk of every executive team as July begins. The organizations that will move well in the second half aren't the ones waiting for the picture to resolve. They're the ones building strategy around the conditions that actually exist, not the ones that were supposed to exist by now. Capital moved to the queue, not to the ground. The capital was there. That part wasn't the problem. What stalled was the infrastructure needed to absorb it. A February 2026 survey by Crux, a clean energy capital platform, found that federal permitting contributed to delays or cancellations for 94% of clean energy developers surveyed, with the average delayed project losing more than 6 months of schedule. Total development costs increased for every respondent, with a majority reporting increases of 6% to 10% and some exceeding 25%. Across those respondents alone, the impacts covered roughly 11 gigawatts of affected capacity in a single year. Alphabet, Amazon, Meta, and Microsoft have collectively signaled capital expenditure plans exceeding $650 billion over the coming years, much of it tied to AI and digital infrastructure expansion, with some projects now waiting up to 5 years for utility power interconnection. The gap between investment commitments and operational capacity continues to widen. Permitting didn't slow because the money ran out. It slowed because the physical and regulatory infrastructure for absorbing investment didn't keep pace with the appetite to deploy it. For executive teams, this changes the H2 deployment assumption at the foundation. Projects that were scheduled to break ground in Q3 or Q4 are now contingency items, not line items. The planning adjustment isn't modest. According to research from McKinsey & Company, cited in a Wimbledon-Dickinson Energy Outlook, infrastructure and energy projects now face materially longer development timelines than a decade ago, with permitting and regulatory review among the largest sources of delay. The compliance map got harder, not easier, between January and June. Executives who expected the regulatory picture to clarify in Q2 are heading into July with a compliance map that's more complicated than the one they started with in January. At the federal level, the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, formally ended its defense of its climate disclosure rules in March 2025, leaving them stayed pending litigation. California's Senate Bill SB 253 remains on track to require large companies to disclose greenhouse gas, GHG emissions, with implementation continuing despite ongoing legal and regulatory challenges. SB 261, a related financial risk disclosure requirement, remains frozen by a Ninth Circuit stay while litigation continues. European frameworks narrowed significantly under the omnibus simplification, reducing mandatory scope by an estimated 85% to 90%. The UK's sustainability disclosure requirements continue to advance, adding another layer of jurisdiction-specific reporting expectations for companies operating internationally. What this produces is not a simpler environment, it's a more jurisdiction-specific one. As A&O Shearman noted in a March 2026 sustainability outlook, regulatory certainty and consistency are increasingly in short supply in the ESG arena, and companies should focus on mapping legal exposure across federal and state rules rather than waiting for a unified framework to emerge. The compliance infrastructure built for one scenario may not be the right one for the next 12 months. That's the reframe. The planning problem for July isn't how to respond to the regulation that was finalized. It's how to operate competently across a patchwork that isn't resolving into a single standard anytime soon. Supply chain accountability didn't ease, it formalized. The third expectation that didn't land, that supply chain pressure would level off as the disruptions of the past few years receded. It didn't level off. It hardened into requirements. Even with implementation adjustments introduced through the omnibus package, companies with significant European exposure continue to face increasing expectations around supply chain due diligence and risk management. The shift from framework to functional process is no longer a future obligation for many companies in scope. Supplier engagement processes need to meet the standard that's being required, not the one from the prior planning cycle. Procurement teams that treated Q2 as a holding period on supplier mapping are now behind. That's a straightforward consequence of the timeline, not an editorial judgment. The accountability window didn't extend because executive attention was elsewhere. What July actually requires. The natural response to a quarter that didn't resolve is to wait for the next one to. That's the planning error to avoid. Perhaps the most important unresolved constraint entering July is electricity availability. Across multiple regions, the question is no longer whether capital is available for expansion, but whether sufficient power can be secured to support it. That applies to data centers, domestic manufacturing, electrification build-out, and reshoring initiatives simultaneously. It's the constraint that touches every other planning assumption on the list. The conditions described above, capital queued at the permitting stage, regulatory fragmentation widening rather than narrowing, supply chain accountability formalizing without a pause, and power availability emerging as its own ceiling, are not temporary states between two clearer moments. They may be the operating environment for the remainder of the year. Building strategy that assumes otherwise is building strategy on a foundation that isn't there. The executive teams that move well in the second half won't be the ones who got lucky with timing. They'll be the ones who stopped planning for resolution and started planning for the constraints themselves. That's a different kind of plan. It's also, at this point, the only kind that's grounded in what's actually true. Sustainability Soundbites energy coverage is sponsored by Amazon. Visit the link in our show notes to learn more about Amazon's spotlight on energy. For sponsorship opportunities with Environment and Energy Leader, please reach out to a member of our team.